I swear to God, I didn't plan to ruin my granddaughter's wedding. But life doesn't really ask for permission before it flips the whole table over. My name's Jessica Parker. I'm 68 years old, gray hair, bad knees, and apparently a secret big enough to make an entire wedding hall go dead silent. And believe me, when that secret came out, you could hear a champagne glass shatter from across the room. Let me take you back to the moment everything started falling apart. The ballroom looked like something straight out of a damn fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers glowing soft gold, white roses everywhere, music floating through the air while people laughed and clinked glasses like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. My granddaughter Emily looked breathtaking. Her dress flowed like silk clouds behind her as she walked through the room greeting guests. I swear my heart nearly burst with pride watching her. I raised that girl, not her parents, me. After my daughter passed away 12 years ago, Emily moved into my little two-bedroom house. I packed her lunches, helped her with homework, stayed up during every fever and every heartbreak. So yeah, this wedding, it meant everything to me. But not everyone in that room was exactly thrilled to see me there, especially my son-in-law, Richard. That man had hated me for years. The kind of hate where someone smiles at you in public, but whispers poison the second you turn your back. And that night, he was watching me like a hawk. I could feel it. Like he was just waiting for the perfect moment to drop something ugly. Still, I tried to ignore it. I was standing near the dessert table when Emily rushed over, practically glowing. "Grandma!" she squealed, wrapping her arms around me. I hugged her tight. "Look at you," I said, shaking my head. "You look like a damn movie star." She laughed. "You're not supposed to swear at weddings." "Sweetheart, I'm 68. I've earned the right." She leaned closer and whispered, "You nervous about your speech?" Oh yeah, the speech. I had one job tonight. Just one. Give a sweet little speech about love and family. Nothing dramatic, nothing controversial. Just memories. But the truth is, there was a part of my past I'd buried for over 40 years. And if that secret ever came out, it wouldn't just ruin the wedding, it would destroy the way Emily saw me forever. I squeezed her hand. "Don't worry," I told her. "Grandma's got this." But the second she walked away, I noticed Richard standing across the room, watching me, with this smug little smile on his face. And something about it made my stomach twist. Because that smile, it looked like the smile of a man who knew something dangerous. An hour later, the reception was in full swing. People were dancing, wine glasses clinking, the band playing old love songs. Then the DJ's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to hear a few words from someone very special, the bride's grandmother, Jessica." My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the microphone, took a deep breath, and looked out at the crowd. Emily was sitting at the sweetheart table with her new husband, smiling up at me with pure love in her eyes. And that's when it hit me. This moment mattered more than anything. So, I started speaking. "I've known Emily since the day she was born," I said, my voice shaking a little. "She came into this world screaming louder than a fire alarm, and honestly, she hasn't slowed down since." The room laughed. Emily rolled her eyes. I continued. "I watched her grow into the kind of woman this world desperately needs. Strong, kind, loyal." My chest tightened. And tonight, seeing her standing here in that beautiful dress, I paused. Then I noticed something strange. Richard had walked up to the DJ booth, and he was whispering to the DJ. The DJ looked confused, then nervous, then he glanced over at me. That uneasy feeling came rushing back, the kind that crawls up your spine. Before I could finish my sentence, the music cut out, the microphone crackled, and suddenly the giant screen behind me lit up. A video. At first, I didn't recognize what I was looking at. The footage looked old, grainy, black and white. But then, my blood turned to ice, because the woman on that screen was me, 40 years younger, standing in a courtroom with handcuffs on my wrists. The entire ballroom froze. People stopped breathing. Someone dropped a fork. And behind me, Richard's voice echoed across the speakers. "Funny how family secrets eventually come out, isn't it, Jessica?" I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn towards me. Emily slowly stood up, her voice barely a whisper. "Grandma?" My hands started shaking because the video hadn't even reached the worst part yet. And when it did, this wedding wouldn't just go silent, it would explode. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The video playing behind me kept rolling, that grainy black and white footage flickering across the giant wedding screen like some ghost from another life. And the worst part? I knew exactly what was coming next. 40 years. 40 damn years I had buried that moment. And now it was staring back at me while 200 wedding guests watched in complete silence. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. Emily slowly stood from her chair. Her voice trembled. "Grandma, what is this?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. But I couldn't answer, because on that screen, the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom recording. "Jessica Parker, you are charged with grand theft and financial fraud." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Someone gasped. Another guest whispered, "Wait, what?" And then the worst part hit. The video showed me being led away in handcuffs. The screen froze right there. My younger face, terrified, broken. A criminal. The room erupted in whispers. Emily looked like someone had ripped the ground out from under her. Her husband looked confused. Her friends were staring at me like I was some kind of stranger. Then slowly, Emily turned toward me. "Grandma, tell me that's not real." God, that look in her eyes nearly killed me, because she didn't sound angry. She sounded hurt. And that's worse, much worse. Before I could say anything, Richard stepped forward, clapping slowly. One slow, sarcastic clap. "Well," he said loudly, "looks like Grandma forgot to mention a few chapters of her life." I turned toward him, my hands shaking. "You son of a—" "Oh no," he interrupted with a smirk. "Let's not start lying now, Jessica. The video speaks for itself." Guests started murmuring louder. Phones were coming out. Some people were already recording. Richard looked at the crowd like a man giving a courtroom presentation. "You see," he continued, "everyone here thinks Jessica is this sweet old lady who raised Emily." He pointed at the screen. "But 40 years ago, she was arrested for stealing nearly $2 million from a company she worked for." Gasps filled the room. Emily's face went pale. 2 million. That number sounded monstrous. Richard crossed his arms. "And she went to prison for it." The word prison hit the room like a bomb. Emily stepped back from me like she'd just touched fire. "Grandma," she whispered. I felt something inside my chest crack, because I knew exactly what she was thinking. Her whole life, she believed I was just a struggling grandmother working 2 jobs to take care of her. Not a criminal, not someone with a prison record. And Richard? He was loving every second of this. I looked straight at him. "You planned this." He smiled wider. "Oh, absolutely." The room went quiet again. "I figured," he said, "if my daughter is marrying into a respectable family tonight, they deserve to know what kind of bloodline they're joining." Emily's husband looked stunned. His parents looked uncomfortable. But Emily? She looked shattered. "Grandma, why didn't you ever tell me?" Her voice broke. And that question hurt more than anything Richard had just done. Because the truth was, I wanted to tell her 1,000 times, but every time I tried, I saw the way she looked at me, like I was her hero, the person who saved her when the rest of the world fell apart, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing that. So I kept quiet for decades. But now, there was no hiding anymore. I stepped away from the microphone stand, walked slowly toward Emily, the entire ballroom watching every step. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "I was going to tell you one day." Richard laughed. "Oh, sure, maybe at her 50th anniversary." I ignored him. Emily wiped tears from her eyes. "So, it's true?" she asked. "You went to prison?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." The room exploded with whispers again. Emily looked like she'd been punched in the stomach. "But," she said, struggling to understand, "you always told me you worked night shifts back then." "I did," I replied quietly, "but not at the job you thought." Her husband spoke up carefully. "Jessica, did you really steal that money?" That question hung in the air like a loaded gun, and Richard immediately jumped in. "Oh, she absolutely—" "No." My voice cut through the room like thunder. Everyone froze. Even Richard stopped talking. I looked straight at him, my voice steady. "I didn't steal a damn thing." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's smirk faltered slightly. Emily blinked. "What?" I took a deep breath. Because if the truth was coming out tonight, then all of it was coming out. Every ugly piece. 40 years ago, I said slowly, I took the blame for a crime I didn't commit. The room went dead quiet again. Emily's brows furrowed. Why would you do that? And that? That was the question I had been avoiding for 40 decades. I turned toward Richard, and for the first time that night, his confident smile disappeared because he already knew what I was about to say. My daughter's husband back then, I continued slowly, was involved with the company where the money disappeared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean my dad?" I nodded. Richard stepped immediately. "That's ridiculous!" But I wasn't done yet. And when the investigation started, I stared directly at him. Someone needed to take the fall. Emily looked between us, confusion flooding her face. "Grandma, what are you saying?" My heart pounded, because the truth I had protected for 40 years was about to destroy the entire room. I stepped straight at Richard and said the words I had buried my whole life. "Your father didn't steal that money." The room held its breath. Then I finished the sentence. "Richard did." The second those words left my mouth, the entire ballroom exploded. "What? That's insane! Did she just accuse him?" Voices started rising everywhere. Emily stood frozen between us like someone stuck in the middle of a storm. "Grandma, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice shaking. But Richard didn't let me answer. "Oh, that is rich," he snapped, stepping forward. "Absolutely rich." He pointed at me like I was some kind of lunatic. "So now the convicted criminal is going to start throwing accusations?" Some guests nodded awkwardly, because on paper, he looked right. I was the one with the prison record. I was the one who had taken the fall. And Richard? He was the successful businessman, the respected father, the man who had spent years building a clean reputation. But the truth? The truth had been rotting under the surface for 40 years, and tonight it was finally clawing its way out. Richard turned to Emily. "Sweetheart," he said in a calm voice, "your grandmother is confused. She's embarrassed after getting exposed, so she's trying to drag someone else down with her." Emily looked back at me. Her eyes were filled with pain. "Grandma, please, tell me you're not just saying this to save yourself." God, that sentence hit me like a punch, because the truth was, saving myself had never been the goal. If it was, I would have spoken up 40 years ago. Instead, I spent 3 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. 3 years away from my daughter. 3 years letting the world believe I was a thief. I took a deep breath. "Emily," I said gently, "do you remember why your mother and I stopped talking to Richard for a few years when you were little?" She frowned slightly. "Mom said it was because of money problems." I shook my head slowly. "No, sweetheart. It was because I found out what he had done." Richard scoffed loudly. "This is unbelievable." But I kept talking. 40 years ago, I worked as an accountant for a construction firm. I handled the internal financial records. People in the room leaned closer now. The whispers started fading because they could feel the story shifting. "One night," I continued, "I noticed something strange in the company accounts." Richard's jaw tightened. Large transfers, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving between shell companies. Emily's husband spoke quietly. "Shell companies?" I nodded. "Fake businesses created to move stolen money." Richard laughed. "Okay, that's enough." But I kept talking, and every one of those transfers led back to one person. The room held its breath. I looked straight at him. "Richard." Emily gasped softly. Richard's face turned red. "This is ridiculous!" But I wasn't finished. You see, Richard had access to those accounts because he was working as an outside contractor for the company. A few older guests exchanged looks. Richard shook his head. "This is a desperate lie." But then I said the one thing he didn't expect. "I still have the documents." The entire room froze again. Richard's expression changed instantly, just for a split second, but I saw it. Fear. Emily noticed it too. "Documents?" she whispered. I nodded. "Copies of the transaction records, the original investigation files, and a letter your mother made me promise never to show anyone unless Richard tried something like this." Richard stepped forward quickly. "That's complete nonsense." But Emily suddenly raised her hand. "Dad, stop." Her voice wasn't weak anymore. It was sharp, suspicious. And that's the moment I realized something important. For the first time tonight, Emily wasn't blindly defending him. She was questioning him. Richard looked at her in shock. "You're not actually believing this, are you?" Emily looked between us. "I don't know what to believe." Then she turned to me again. "If what you're saying is true, why didn't you fight the charges back then?" That question echoed through the room. And the answer? The answer was the ugliest part of this entire story. I swallowed hard. "Because your mother begged me not to." Emily blinked. "What?" I nodded slowly. "Richard told her if I exposed him, he would disappear, take you with him, and she would never see her daughter again." Gasps filled the ballroom. Emily's face went pale. What?" I continued quietly. "Your mother was terrified. You were only 3 years old. She thought losing me for a few years was better than losing you forever." Richard shouted suddenly, "That's a lie!" But his voice sounded different now. Not confident, desperate. Emily stared at him. "Dad, did you really threaten Mom like that?" "I never said that." But the room was already shifting. People weren't looking at me as the villain anymore. Now they were looking at him. And that's when something unexpected happened. A man near the back of the ballroom stood up. Slowly. He looked older, maybe mid-70s, gray suit, serious face, and when he spoke, the entire room turned towards him. "Actually," he said calmly, "Jessica is telling the truth." Every head snapped in his direction. Emily frowned. "Who are you?" The man walked forward through the crowd. "My name is Daniel Brooks, and 40 years ago, I was the detective assigned to the missing money case." The ballroom fell silent again. Richard looked like someone had just drained the blood from his body. Because Daniel Brooks wasn't finished. He looked straight at him, then said the one sentence that made the entire wedding feel like a courtroom. "Back then, we suspected Jessica was covering for someone." He paused, then added quietly, "And that someone was you." For a moment, no one in the ballroom moved. No music, no whispers. Just 200 people staring at the older man who had just stepped out of the crowd and turned my granddaughter's wedding into a courtroom. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he repeated calmly. "And 40 years ago, I was the detective assigned to Jessica's case." Emily looked completely stunned. "You're saying you worked on my grandmother's arrest?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Then he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in decades. Respect. "You probably don't remember me," he said gently. I gave a small, tired smile. "Oh, I remember you." Because he had been the only officer back then who ever looked at me like I might be innocent. Back when everyone else had already decided I was guilty. Richard suddenly laughed loudly, a forced laugh. "Oh, come on," he said. "So now we've got some random old guy showing up to defend a convicted criminal?" Daniel turned toward him slowly. The calm in his eyes made Richard's voice shrink just a little. "I'm not random," Daniel said. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. The room leaned forward. "I kept a copy of something from that investigation," he said. Richard scoffed. "You can't just bring some piece of paper to a wedding and pretend it proves anything." Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked toward Emily, carefully, respectfully. "This belongs to your grandmother," he said. He handed her the envelope. Emily looked down at it like it weighed 100 pounds. "What is it?" Daniel spoke quietly. "Financial transfer records from the night the money disappeared." Richard's face tightened. "That's impossible." But Emily had already opened the envelope. Inside were several photocopied documents, old, yellowed, but clear. She flipped through them slowly, her brows furrowed. "These numbers, I don't understand them." Daniel pointed gently. "Look at the authorization codes." Emily leaned closer. Her eyes moved across the page. Then suddenly, she froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Wait." She flipped to the last page, then looked up, straight at her father. "Dad, these signatures." The entire room held its breath. "They're yours." A wave of gasps rolled through the ballroom. Richard immediately stepped forward. "That's ridiculous!" But his voice cracked slightly. Daniel folded his arms. "The transfers were authorized using a contractor clearance code," he explained. "Jessica didn't have that level of access." He looked at Richard again. But Richard did. Emily slowly turned toward her father, her hands shaking now. "Dad, please tell me this isn't real." Richard looked around the room. For the first time all night, he looked trapped. "Those papers could be fake," he snapped. "Anyone could print something like that." Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked toward Emily, carefully, respectfully. "This belongs to your grandmother," he said. He handed her the envelope. Emily looked down at it like it weighed 100 pounds. "What is it?" Daniel spoke quietly. "Financial transfer records from the night the money disappeared." Richard's face tightened. "That's impossible." But Emily had already opened the envelope. Inside were several photocopied documents, old, yellowed, but clear. She flipped through them slowly, her brows furrowed. "These numbers, I don't understand them." Daniel pointed gently. "Look at the authorization codes." Emily leaned closer. Her eyes moved across the page. Then suddenly, she froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Wait." She flipped to the last page, then looked up, straight at her father. "Dad, these signatures." The entire room held its breath. "They're yours." A wave of gasps rolled through the ballroom. Richard immediately stepped forward. "That's ridiculous!" But his voice cracked slightly. Daniel folded his arms. "The transfers were authorized using a contractor clearance code," he explained. "Jessica didn't have that level of access." He looked at Richard again. But Richard did. Emily slowly turned toward her father, her hands shaking now. "Dad, please tell me this isn't real." Richard looked around the room. For the first time all night, he looked trapped. "Those papers could be fake," he snapped. "Anyone could print something like that." Daniel nodded calmly. "You're right." Then he reached into his jacket again and pulled out something else, a small USB drive. This contains the original investigation records that were recently digitized when the police department archived old cases. The room went dead quiet again. "I requested access to the file last week, and I found something interesting." Richard swallowed hard. "What?" Daniel's voice stayed calm. The case against Jessica was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. He looked at the crowd. No stolen money was ever found in her possession. People started murmuring again. Then Daniel added the sentence that changed everything. "But we did find where the money ended up." Emily whispered softly. "Where?" Daniel pointed directly at Richard. "In an offshore account opened under one of his shell companies." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush the room. Emily slowly stepped back from her father. "No!" Richard shook his head quickly. "This is insane!" But his voice sounded panicked now. Sweat had started forming on his forehead. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "did you steal that money?" "No!" But the word came out too fast, too desperate, and everyone could hear it. Emily looked like her entire world was cracking apart. "You let my grandmother go to prison?" she whispered. Richard's face twisted. "She offered." Gasps erupted across the room. He realized what he had just said. Too late. Emily's eyes widened. "You mean it's true?" Richard tried to recover. "No, that's not what I meant." But the damage was done. The entire ballroom had heard it. Daniel spoke calmly again. "For 40 years, Jessica kept quiet." He looked around the room. "She served 3 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit." Then he turned toward Emily. "To protect you." Emily's tears started falling now. She slowly looked at me. "Grandma, is that true?" I nodded softly. "I didn't want you growing up without a father." Her shoulders started shaking. Richard stepped forward. "Emily, sweetheart, you don't understand the whole story." "Stop!" Her voice cracked through the room like thunder. Everyone froze. Emily looked at him with tears streaming face her face. "You let my grandmother go to prison." Her voice trembled. "For you!" Richard didn't answer, because he couldn't. And that's when something even worse happened. A voice spoke from near the entrance of the ballroom. Cold. Official. "Actually, Mr. Richard Parker." Every head turned. 2 uniformed police officers were standing in the doorway. One of them stepped forward slowly. "Might want to finish that story at the station." The room erupted again. Emily whispered weakly, "Police?" The officer looked at Daniel Brooks. "Detective Brooks contacted us earlier this week after reviewing the archived evidence." Then he looked straight at Richard. "We reopened the case yesterday." Richard's face turned ghost white. The officer reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and said the words no one expected to hear at a wedding reception. "Richard Parker, you are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." The entire ballroom fell silent again, because after 40 years, justice had finally caught up. But the night wasn't over yet, not even close, because Emily hadn't said a word to me since the truth came out, and I had no idea if I had just saved her life or completely destroyed our relationship forever. No one moved. Not the guests, not the band, not even the waiters who were frozen beside their serving trays. The only sound in the ballroom was the quiet click of metal. The police officer snapped the handcuffs around Richard's wrists. That sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Richard immediately jerked his arms back. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted. "You can't arrest me at my daughter's wedding." The officer's voice stayed calm. Sir, we can, and we are. Richard looked around the room desperately, at the guests, at Emily, at me, like he was searching for someone to stop this. But nobody moved, because now everyone knew the truth. Emily stood there shaking, her wedding dress trembling with every breath. "Dad," she whispered. Richard turned to her quickly. "Sweetheart, listen to me," he said urgently. "This is all a misunderstanding. Your grandmother and that detective are twisting old evidence. Stop!" Emily's voice cracked again. But this time it wasn't weak. It was angry, raw. "How could you?" she asked. Her tears were falling faster now. "You let Grandma go to prison." Richard shook his head. "You don't understand the situation. You let her go to prison." Her voice echoed across the ballroom. Guests looked away uncomfortably, because this wasn't just a wedding anymore. This was a family breaking apart in front of them. Richard's voice dropped. "Emily, I was trying to protect our family." I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Protect it?" I said slowly. He looked at me with hatred. "Yes," he snapped, "because if the truth had come out back then, everything would have been destroyed." I stared at him. "You mean your life would have been destroyed?" He didn't respond. And that silence, it said everything. The police officer gently took Richard's arm. "Sir, we need to leave now." Richard resisted slightly. Then he looked at Emily again, his voice suddenly softer. "Sweetheart, please, tell them this is ridiculous." Emily stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she whispered something that broke the entire room. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Richard's shoulders dropped. The officer began guiding him toward the exit. As he passed me, he leaned close and hissed quietly, "This isn't over." I looked him straight in the eye. "It was over 40 years ago," I said. "You just didn't know it yet." The ballroom doors opened, and Richard Parker, the man who had destroyed my life decades ago, was finally taken away in handcuffs. The doors closed behind him, and suddenly the room felt incredibly quiet. But the hardest part was still coming, because Emily slowly turned toward me, and I could see the storm in her eyes. Pain, confusion, heartbreak. She walked toward me slowly, every step echoing across the silent ballroom. I didn't know what she was going to say, or if she would ever forgive me. She stopped just a few feet away. "Grandma!" Her voice was shaking again. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" God, that question hurt more than prison ever did. I sighed softly. "Because I didn't want you growing up thinking your father was a criminal." Her eyes filled with tears again. "But you went to prison for him." I nodded. "Yes." She looked down at the floor, then whispered something that made the entire room hold its breath. "You gave up 3 years of your life." Her voice cracked. "For me." I didn't answer, because the truth was simple. Of course I did. She suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, tightly, so tight I almost lost my balance. "I'm so sorry," she cried into my shoulder. My chest tightened. For 40 years, I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but I never thought it would actually happen. I hugged her back gently. "It's okay," I whispered. But Emily pulled back slightly. Her eyes were red. "No, it's not okay." She turned toward the guests, toward the entire ballroom. Then she grabbed the microphone from the stand. Her voice trembled but stayed strong. "Everyone, I think you all just witnessed the worst wedding speech in history." A few guests chuckled awkwardly. She wiped her tears. "But I want to say something." The room went quiet again. Emily looked straight at me. This woman raised me when my world fell apart. Her voice softened. She packed my school lunches, stayed up with me when I was sick, helped me with every bad decision I ever made. Guests were listening carefully now. And tonight, I found something I never knew. She paused, then said proudly, "My grandmother is the strongest person I have ever known." My throat tightened. Emily smiled through her tears. She sacrificed everything to protect me. She squeezed my hand. And if anyone here thinks that makes her a criminal, her voice grew stronger, they clearly don't know what love really looks like. The room burst into applause. People stood up, clapping loudly, some guests even wiping tears. But Emily wasn't finished yet. She looked at me again. "Grandma, I have one more question." I nodded gently. "What is it, sweetheart?" She smiled softly. "Do you still have your speech?" I blinked. "What?" She laughed quietly. "The one you were trying to give before my dad ruined everything." I chuckled. "Somewhere in my purse, probably." She handed me the microphone again. "Well," she said with a warm smile, "I think everyone here would still like to hear it." The crowd cheered, and for the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't in decades. Peace. But I still didn't know one thing: how this wedding was going to end, because after everything that happened tonight, no one knew if the celebration could even continue. For a few seconds, I just stood there holding the microphone. The entire ballroom was looking at me again. But this time, the feeling was different. Earlier, they were staring at me like I was a criminal. Now, they were looking at me like they were finally seeing who I really was. Emily squeezed my hand gently. "You got this, Grandma." I laughed softly. "Well," I said into the microphone, "this speech definitely didn't go the way I planned." The room chuckled. A little tension finally broke. I glanced down at the small folded paper I had pulled from my purse, the speech I had written that morning, back when I thought the biggest challenge tonight would be remembering my reading glasses. I shook my head. "You know," I continued, "when you reach 68 years old, you realize something important about life." The room grew quiet again. "Plans rarely work the way you expect them to." A few people nodded. "But love," I said softly, looking at Emily, "love always finds a way." Emily's eyes started watering again. I continued speaking. "When Emily was born, I held her in my arms and promised myself something." My voice softened. "I promised I would always protect her." The room listened carefully. And sometimes protecting someone means making sacrifices. I didn't mention prison. I didn't mention the past. I didn't need to. Everyone already knew. But tonight, I said, smiling gently, I realized something else. I turned toward Emily and her husband. Emily doesn't need protecting anymore. Emily smiled through her tears. "She's strong." I pointed playfully at her husband. "And if this young man ever forgets that," the crowd laughed, "I'm still old enough to smack him with my purse." The room burst into laughter. Even Emily's husband laughed nervously. Then I took a deep breath. "But the real reason we're all here tonight isn't family drama," the crowd chuckled again. "It's love." I looked at the newly married couple. "And marriage isn't about perfect moments." My voice became calm. "It's about standing beside each other when life gets messy." People nodded quietly. "Because trust me," I smiled, "life gets messy." The room laughed again. Then I raised my glass. "So let's forget the chaos of tonight." I looked around the room and remember why we're here. I raised the glass higher. To Emily and Michael. The guests followed. To love. Glasses clinked across the ballroom. The band slowly started playing again. Soft music filled the room. And just like that, the wedding came back to life. Guests started talking again, people hugged, the tension slowly melted away. Emily turned toward me and hugged me again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." I smiled. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Then she surprised me again. "Actually, I think you deserve something tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Emily suddenly grabbed the microphone again. "Everyone!" The crowd looked back toward her. "I just realized something important." She pointed at me. "My grandmother missed a lot of celebrations because of what happened in the past." The room listened. "So tonight," she grinned, "we're giving her one." I frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" Emily turned toward the band. "Can you play one more song?" The band leader smiled. "Of course." Soft music started playing again. Then Emily grabbed my hand. "Grandma," she laughed, "you're dancing with me." I groaned dramatically. "Oh no, sweetheart. These knees retired years ago." The guests laughed. But Emily pulled me gently toward the dance floor anyway. "Too late," she said. "You're the guest of honor now." The crowd clapped and cheered, and before I knew it, I was standing in the middle of the dance floor with my granddaughter, music playing, people smiling, lights glowing above us. 40 years of pain, finally feeling lighter. Emily hugged me again during the dance. "You know something?" she whispered. "What?" She smiled. "You're the real hero in this family." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart." I looked at her proudly. "You are." Because the truth is, life doesn't give us perfect stories. Sometimes it gives us messy ones, painful ones, stories filled with mistakes and sacrifices. But every once in a while, if you're lucky, the truth comes out. Justice catches up, and love wins anyway. And that night, at my granddaughter's wedding, after 40 years of silence, my story finally had its ending.